We have three here now.
So about 15 years ago, and I'm sure that Bill will correct me if it's longer or shorter than that, but anyway, about 15 years ago, there was a wonderful panel with our dear friend Ken May, and Marlene Heiser and Bill and I were sitting there and we said, this is such a rich discussion about journalism and what needs to be covered. And we really need to find a way to include more journalists in the Labor Employment Relations Association, and also to have an update on a regular basis of what's going on in labor relations from the perspective of our journalists. And so Marlene and Bill and David and I sat around and had a discussion about what the criteria would be for an award, and then what we would expect from the people who had received the award. And so a couple of things came out of that. First of all, the four of us would on a regular basis read everything we could in terms of labor management and employment relations. And then we would get together and select people that we thought we should award the media award to. The first award went, of course, to Ken May, and now that award is named after Ken because Ken had been with BNA, the Bureau of National Affairs, for many, many years and covered not only what was going on in the labor management community, but also read extensively labor arbitrator reports, our awards and all, and then put out the volume on a regular basis. So Ken was really deeply involved and had been a longtime member of first IRA, and then when we changed the name to LERA, continued his membership. So we have the annual award. The other part of that annual award is that each year we would ask journalists to help us to look back at the prior year and what might be on the forecast for the coming year, and to give us some insight, and also for the journalists and to have a rich variety of people in our membership from whom they could gather information, so that it would really be a two-way street and open the door for more journalism. Those of us who are old enough to remember back into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, people like Harry Bernstein of the LA Times was a regular contributor and really had the labor beat. And it was true of the New York Times, Post, all of them. And over the years, why that labor beat really changed and just became general information. Anybody on the journalism trail would be handling it. So we're getting back, I think, to a point where we have more people who are, in fact, looking at labor management relationships and labor and employment. And so this year, David put together this fabulous panel. And first, I'd like to ask you each if you would talk a bit about your journey in labor management relationships and how you got here. We have with us today Lydia DePillis. And Lydia, we have followed you from the Washington Post to Houston and now on to the New York Times. Josh, you've been with Bloomberg, and we always enjoy hearing from you. And Juliana with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Noam Scheiber also with the New York Times. So could we start off with you, Josh, giving us a bit of your history and also your journey in the labor management community and what you see as some of the issues that we're covering.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, David and Bonnie. Thanks to Wilma for all she does to make LERA happen. Thanks to everyone attending. It's really a special delight to be part of this particular panel with three of my favorite journalists. As you said, I work for Bloomberg News in our magazine Business Week. I cover capital L labor and lowercase l labor. So the workplace, and particularly conflicts over workers' rights, power, and compensation as they play out in the workplace, in the government, and in the courts. This year, that's included stories about these stunning, spreading labor campaigns at places like Amazon and Starbucks, about alleged workplace misconduct by an AFL-CIO leader, and about nurses brought to the US from the Philippines under contracts that included fees of $20,000 or more if they quit their jobs. So part of my work is to try to write stories that have something to say for the sort of experts that are part of LERA and for a more general audience that is not as familiar with these issues. And I rely tremendously on the expertise of experts who help explain issues to me and sources of all sorts who come forward with stories, whether it's people who are eager to see their name in print or people who are dead set on never having their name appear in print. And I hope anyone listening will consider coming to talk to me about their own work or about things happening in the workplace. Before I was a journalist, worked in the labor movement at Unite Here for 5 years. And then I was a freelance journalist before coming to Salon and then to Bloomberg and Business Week. The job description has shifted over time, but throughout, my main focus has been writing about the workplace, and it's been exciting to see increasing public attention to these issues and increasing appetite for stories about what's happening with capital L labor and with lowercase l labor alike. And I'm excited for this discussion.
Thank you very much, Josh. And of course, things are changing a good deal over this last decade. So we really appreciate you keeping on top of all of that. Lydia, would you be kind enough to tell us about your journey?
Yeah, so it's great to be here, see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Super honored to be on a panel with some journalists that I've followed forever and really respect. And I just joined the New York Times. I cover the economy broadly right now, but did a stint at the Washington Post where I was covering labor specifically. And this was a time of like around 2014, 2015, when there started to be this resurgence in labor activism, and also people were becoming aware of the sort of ravages of the fissured economy, and gig work was becoming a thing, and folks were just starting to realize that it wasn't all like really excellent for everybody. And so that was really formative in terms of like how I see the economy, which is a beat I then proceeded to take up at the Houston Chronicle, and then to CNN, and then ProPublica, where I covered all kinds of things, but always kind of with this lens of like basically labor power and what it's doing and what that means for the economy. And so I think that, you know, workers are, I'm not sure if there's a percentage I could assign to them, but in terms of like a part of the economy, just like a super, super important factor. And it's been fascinating to me to see, you know, this readjustment going on with wages and, you know, and a realignment of a type of bargaining power, right? Just simply as a consequence of like the wacky economy that we have right now. And so I think how that will feed into my beat going forward is just trying to suss out whether that is durable at all and whether anything has truly changed. So I'll let others speak, but I'm excited for the discussion.
Hey, thank you very much, Lydia. And we've been following you for a long time, it seems, in your various travels. So, Juliana, I wonder if you'd be willing to go next.
Sure. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you.
Also really happy to be here. When I started on the labor beat in about 2018, I made a list of like labor reporter idols, and everyone on this panel was on them. And I was trying to like emulate them. So it's cool to be on this panel. So yeah, I the beginning of my career was in tech reporting, and it was largely in covering startups in Philadelphia through the lens of founders and venture capitalists. And it wasn't often through the lens of workers. And then I did an investigative piece about workers at a tech company and found that they really had the best stories. You were going to find the best stuff from workers, and you couldn't just listen to what the people at the top were saying. And so then I got a job at the Inquirer, and they had hired me to cover workplace culture, but their labor reporter, their veteran labor reporter, was not going to be replaced. She was taking a buyout, and she wasn't going to be replaced. So I found that as my in to taking on the labor beat, and slowly started pitching stories and officially became the official labor reporter. But last year, I took a job on the investigative team. And so now I don't have a specific beat so much, though I do cover labor. I could do labor investigations, but I also cover other things as well.
Hey, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And there's probably a fair amount to investigate these days in what's going on in the labor management community. So we'll come back around to that. Hey,
Say,
and
Bonnie,
Noam, would you be kind enough to share? What?
Bonnie,
I'm
I have
yeah.
a question for Juliana about something she said. When
Sure.
you were given an assignment to cover, I think you used the phrase organization culture.
Workplace culture.
Workplace culture, yeah. Were you ever given a definition of what that was?
Yeah, the way that they had envisioned it at the paper, it was a new beat, and they wanted it to be stories about the passive aggressive notes that people leave on the office fridge and office parties in the age of Me Too, that kind of thing, kind of like a Sunday Styles, culture, sort of a softer kind of look at issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And Norm, are you?
Hi. Yep.
Yeah, there you are. Good. Thank you.
Hi. So I just want to correct. My name is Noam, N-O-A-M.
Noam, I'm so sorry.
Okay. I had kind of a similar path to other folks on this panel. I spent the first 14 and a half years of my career at the New Republic. Actually, Lydia and I overlapped there. For the large portion of that, I covered economic policy and politics. I covered a few presidential campaigns and wrote a book about the Obama administration that was focused on economic policy and their response to the Great Recession. This was, pretty heavily economic policy focused, and obviously, because it was the response to the Great Recession, that implicated workers quite a bit. The last year or two I was at the New Republic, I started getting into kind of tech, and that really quickly got me into labor issues. A lot of thinking about gig work. This was kind of the beginning of what we call the sharing economy at that point. I think we call it more honestly the gig economy now. So a lot of thinking and writing about gig work, some about discrimination. And I came to the New York Times in 2015. Steve Greenhouse, very eminent and accomplished labor reporter, had just retired, and I kind of stepped into those shoes in early 2015. My mandate was kind of labor in the workplace broadly. I'd say probably more lowercase L than uppercase L. We really thought of it not so much as an institutional beat. You wouldn't cover, large unions or the AFL the way you would cover the White House or something. Obviously, those institutions mattered on some level, but the beat definitely wasn't about covering those. It was really focused on workers and who they were and the problems they encountered and the workplace that they worked in. I would say when I started, the focus was really about the lack of worker power and things that were undermining worker power. It was automation, surveillance, gamification, gig work, misclassification, scheduling issues, just-in-time scheduling, then traditional things like discrimination and harassment. All of those things were really, I'd say, on the ascent, and obviously had been for a period of decades. So it was really about the things that were chipping away at worker power in various ways. I would say, as some of my co-panelists have pointed out, the last year or two or three, maybe, yeah, I'd say last 3 years. I don't know, maybe I'd mark the shift with the teacher walkouts in 2018. It's been much more of a balanced story about, places where workers are losing power and then places where workers are gaining power. So I think that's been a welcome change, not so much because I have a rooting interest, though as a worker, I guess I do, but, personally, I like, I am a worker, so I probably benefit myself, but just, interesting to tell a different story, it's, my job is to tell the story as honestly and truthfully and in as detailed a way as I can, regardless of what it is. But I think in the same way that, like, if you're a sports reporter and you're covering a team that loses, year in and year out for 40 years, it gets less interesting. It gets a little less interesting when workers are losing power year in, year out for a period of decades, and when they start to win power in the same way that it gets more interesting when the team starts to win. Narratively speaking, it starts to get a little more interesting, and you start to think about things in different ways. There are new stories and new angles to explore. So yeah, that's kind of where we are today.
Hey, thank you so much, Noam. David, you took your mic off. Did you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to ask Noam and our other panelists, today, which of you and others who do labor and workplace reporting are actually employees, and which are contractors, independent contractors, freelancers, maybe?
I think all of us are employees. Obviously, there's been a huge shift in the structure of the journalism industry, like a lot of industries, toward contracting relationships, outsourcing, pushing people outside the firm. So journalism is not exempted from those trends. In fact, it's probably been one of the epicenters of those trends, I would say. You've had a huge consolidation of the industry from dozens and dozens of local outlets that once had themselves dozens of of employees, and as there's been this consolidation, we've lost that kind of middle tier and geographically diffuse tier. A lot of those jobs have either just disappeared or become contracting jobs. And then you've had a real growth in, like, national outlets. I think my own and the Journal and the Washington Post, some smaller ones like ProPublica, Bloomberg, obviously. So yeah, I think it's the story is pretty similar to a whole variety of industries. Consolidation, the hollowing out of the middle, pushing relationships outside the firm, contracting, gig work, we're no different. In fact, probably really at the center of it.
Well, as you would know, and some of you have written about this, in what was it, November 2020, there was a ballot proposition in California to Proposition 22 to preserve the question to voters was, should the independent contractor arrangement, especially for rideshare and food delivery companies, be retained, or should those folks have to be converted to employment? That was the big issue, still is. The LA Times and the Orange County Register and 6 other newspapers, the Sacramento Bee, lobbied the California state legislature to exclude them from the then new law so that they could keep the independent contracting arrangement rather than have to convert the independent contractors to employees. So the industry that you four are in has so many interesting features, interesting to LERA members, and this is one of them. Is somebody an employee or is somebody a contractor?
Josh covered that fight closer than any of us probably. But I mean, one thing I would note is that although probably, I don't know if there's like an analysis of the freelancer employee split in journalism, I'm sure it's shifted more towards freelancers. And there's sort of like high class and low class freelancers, like just like any gig work, right? There's like folks where it's like really piecework. And then there's like magazine writers who get paid $2 a word and make a fairly good living. I mean, that's a tiny slice. But it has been interesting to me, and we'll probably get to this later, like the massive organizing wave in journalism has pushed back on that a little bit, right? Because there was, for example, a pretty well-developed stable of folks who were paid some kind of rate at SB Nation, for example, which is part of Vox Media. And then when they unionized, I think that switched over. I don't know the details of that arrangement, but I think that business model came under pressure as folks unionized. I think this is something like this happened at Huffington Post as well. So I think that tide has probably slowed a little bit, although everything is different kind of on the local level.
A couple things that come to mind on this point for me. One is that I think the wave of organizing we've seen in media, especially prior to more recent months, where you have the Amazon and Starbucks and Apple and REI organizing going on. One of the things that's interesting to me about the media organizing is it demonstrates unions' reliance often on comprehensive campaigns, where in part the target is the brand of the employer. And so it makes sense that places like Gawker, for example, were more vulnerable to these comprehensive campaigns, where the main leverage that the union had was not the ability to shut down production, but the ability to hurt the company's brand and its sense of itself and its consumers' sense of it. And that we saw media companies be overall more sensitive to media coverage and other forms of public shaming than some companies that, if you're, say, Palantir, you may not care as much about your media coverage as if you are the LA Times or Gawker, and that turned out to be an important lever, as well as, like we've seen at Starbucks and elsewhere, just how a victory in a few places can very quickly make victory elsewhere seem possible. Another thing I think is interesting there to your question is that we have seen unions win elections or recognition among people who were classified as employees, and then use the leverage they have there at places like the LA Times and the New Yorker to also win changes to the classification of other workers and people who had been subcontracted employees, so W-2 employees, but not considered employees of the main company, be converted to direct employees. And so organizing among people who are direct employees can also be a way to make changes to that fissured structure for other workers in the same workforce.
And that happens even among legacy unions, like at NPR, where I am in DC. The News Guild, I think, helped, but like there was you might not realize, but there were tons of reporters who were just on temp contracts and like totally contingent, like had no idea if they would be employed from month to month. And this actually changed when there was a big Me Too scandal, and some temps there said, hey, like it's very difficult. One of the victim of that harassment was a temp employee, and she said, like, listen, how do you expect me to speak up when this person controls my employment? And so that has shifted. It's been a really salutary change, I think.
So it sounds like there's been a rebalancing within the industry in terms of how reporters and journalists are treated. Is that an accurate assumption on my part?
I don't think that's true across the industry.
Okay. With some of the larger outlets, is that where it's happening, Lydia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to monopolize, but I think that there is for sure like this pulling apart, right? Economy-wide and in the journalism industry, where you have national reporters at these big outlets who are well paid, and then I don't know that wages have moved or budged. I mean, I worked at the Houston Chronicle and was fairly like well paid by the standards of the paper, but you know, shocked to find how little people are paid. And that was maybe sort of okay when like cost of living were relatively low, but I think that's changing fairly quickly too. And so you see like you still see like hordes of people leaving the industry because there's no way to like build a career and have a family on the wages that people are paid. So yeah, I don't think it's I think there's like I think it's a very difficult force in media to deal with.
So as all of you look at the economics of our system and the tremendous income inequality, how are you dealing with that in terms of your own reporting? And you know, we've all been reading all of the various papers, so we know you're reporting on that. But the income inequality seems to be a real driver in terms of what's happening with the organizing that's going on, as well as worker conditions, which when I was organizing way back when, it was really working conditions that were driving it, because our income was more equal in the 60s and 70s, and it certainly is today. That wedge of income inequality is just huge now. How are you looking at that?
I can weigh in here. Yeah, I think it's no question. I mean, obviously inequality has been pretty high and right, historically high since like the late 90s, the 90s. So it's not a new feature of the landscape. I mean, clearly it was something that that motivated certain segments of workers during the pandemic. There was the sense that we're on the front lines, we're literally risking our lives, and our employers are making more money than ever before. Obviously, that was a theme of the Amazon campaign, and even some of the strikes that we saw last year. John Deere, Kellogg. So that was very much a pronounced theme of the pandemic, and I think it really drew that out. I think before that, it was certainly kind of in the ether, but I don't, and sort of informed how people felt. I don't know that it was quite kind of the centerpiece of typical organizing campaign. Yeah, I mean, to me, what's interesting, I guess the flip side of the pandemic and inequality and the focus on inequality during the pandemic is, this question of whether we're going to see some kind of long-term structural change, both in worker power and inequality. And that's, I guess I'm more skeptical of that. We've obviously seen this increase in worker power. We've seen this apparent uptick in organizing, certainly at some high profile employers. I mean, my skepticism comes from the fact that I think these models, these employment and labor models that really reduce worker power and increase inequality, I think they're so heavily baked into the labor models and the business models of major employers that it's really hard to see how they change. I did a piece a few months ago about, they try to get at this through the lens of full-time work versus part-time work versus insufficient hours, versus sufficient hours. And, you'd expect, we hear from every employer basically that it's really hard to hire workers. The job market is so tight, quit rates are high, openings are off the charts. And yet, you talk to a lot of workers, particularly workers in service professions where just-in-time scheduling is kind of the norm. And what they'll tell you is, well, my schedule's still terrible, it's still hugely volatile and unstable, really wreaks havoc on my life, and I don't get enough hours. Like I need more hours. And yet when you ask employers, like, okay, well, are you going to make scheduling more stable? Are you going to give people more hours? Are you going to convert more people from part-time to full-time? They say, nah, we're going to give them a bonus. And that to me just perfectly distilled this moment where, a lot of frustration over inequality, a lot of leverage ostensibly for workers because the labor market is tight. And yet we weren't really seeing any fundamental shift in the model, the kind of, whether it was fissuring as David Weil has written about, or scheduling that's often kind of adjacent to fissuring arrangements. Like, I talked to, we covered this, and I know Josh covered this and others did, the Kroger strike in Colorado and the negotiations in California and Washington State. And, part-time work was a huge problem there. A lot of those workers felt like they weren't getting enough hours to live on and wanted to be full-time, or at least have more hours and more stable hours. And when you would talk to the union leaders who were sitting across the table from the company, they would press on this. And, they did get some concessions in the Colorado contract, but basically what the company would say is, you know what, we think this is temporary. We're just going to wait it out. So we'll pay you a little more, but we see no reason to completely rethink our business model here. So we're sticking with what we got. We're sticking with the just-in-time scheduling. We're sticking with the outsourcing arrangements to the extent that we can. And, I think that's just a pretty good evidence of how baked in this stuff is and how much more it would take to really get employers to rethink these arrangements.
I just want to jump in to commend Noam's piece, which was terrific, and I think particularly noteworthy as an example of the importance of journalism about what is not changing. And I know sometimes for some of us, it can be challenging to get stories published about things that are remaining the same or about things not being as new as they might be said to be on Twitter. And I think we have an important role as journalists in pointing out where there's continuity or where a window hasn't opened or a window has been closed. And again, I just thought it was a terrific piece.
So Bonnie, we have a couple of questions from folks here, and we also have a hand raised by Bill Canick. Stephen Sylvia asks, do you as national labor reporters talk to local reporters on the business/labor beat? For example, Mike Paré of the Chattanooga Times Free Press. So that's a question to our journalist panelists.
I feel like local reporters have enough to do without like trying to help us. I do read their stuff for sure. And I think it's like incredibly valuable, having been a local journalist for a big chunk of my career. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
As the local labor reporter on the panel, yeah, sometimes, I mean, I've definitely talked to Josh when I had questions about how to cover something, and read a lot of national labor reporting as a way to find like local echoes.
Peter Fugil asks the following question. He says, I have a question about selecting workers for interviews or quotes. How much do you rely on labor and advocacy groups to connect you to workers, and how much do you try to identify or contact workers directly? Are there situations where you make more of an effort to find or cultivate your own sources within a company or workplace? That's a series of questions. Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Sure, yeah, I can go. So when I was doing daily labor reporting, I was relying really heavily on labor and advocacy groups to find people to talk, because often we're working on like a daily or just a few day like deadline. And if I was doing a bigger piece, then and I had more time, and if it was like, say, a piece about a certain corporation or workplace, then I would put in more time to find people outside of the folks that labor would connect me with. And that was a big reason why I wanted to move away from the daily labor reporting, because sometimes it felt really, it could sort of feel formulaic in ways. Like we'd have a story, a topic, and then I knew I needed to talk to like maybe 3 workers about it. And I couldn't really go deep on it because of the time, the time limit.
So how do you work with that time limit then with your employer? It's an interesting aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, if I felt like I needed more time on something, I would ask for it, but oftentimes that time would be in increments of days and not weeks, depending on the kind of story. And oftentimes, especially during the pandemic, it was like especially in the first year, it was like, there's a new mask mandate, and like, what's the angle that we can have from labor, like what's the labor angle? And so there wasn't always a lot of time to negotiate for more time.
Yeah, because everything was so time sensitive. To
Right.
try and do a long piece, it was a challenge.
Yeah, it was part of the deal, part of the expectation.
Bill
Thank you.
Canick, do you have a question? You had your hand up before?
Yep. Is he there?
Well, I think he is. He's on mute.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah, I'm not seeing him
here.
right now.
I was starting to write in the chat room. This discussion about changing work models for employees at large and private sector employers led me to think about the workers in the public sector at the state level around the United States, in states that have dismantled civil service protections and standards for hiring. My home state of Wisconsin, Tennessee here have gone that. And then I'm looking forward, I can think that GOP-led legislatures and governors may go a long way toward dismantling the civil service protections for public sector workers. And what you as labor journalists see as impacts in the public sector for the kinds of changes. We've been talking largely about private sector economic changes and how that affects inequality and work models. But when you look at we have an enormous public sector employee population in the United States. And have you been thinking about this, and is this on your agenda to consider in your future reporting? That's my question.
Hey, any one of you?
I can weigh in briefly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, well, I'd speak for myself. I don't think of public sector workers as like an independent subject area that I, lay out for myself to cover. Obviously, issues arise among public sector workers, and as they arise, tend to cover them. I think is probably, you alluded to some of the kind of greatest hits of the last decade or so, Wisconsin, and some of the rollback of bargaining rights. And in other states, Ohio had a big push under Kasich. And then, certainly in the Trump administration, there was a real determined effort to kind of roll back rights for federal employees. And, I covered that, I know my colleagues, Josh did too. And, that I specifically remember a federal judge named Ketanji Brown Jackson, writing a very stern opinion in response to some of the Trump administration's executive orders on federal employees, bargaining rights and leverage. So, I would say these things obviously loom very large. There are millions of public sector workers, and when issues arise in their workplace, we certainly address them, but it's not like a specific subbeat that I kind of every week go in thinking like, okay, what's happening in the public sector realm this week that I should be aware
of? Two things I'd note quickly about this. One is we saw an intensity and a broad sweep of efforts in Republican trifecta states where they had governorships and legislatures a decade ago, as Noam said, to make these sweeping changes to public sector employment. It doesn't seem to me that there has been an equivalent on the other side, though we have seen in recent years some places like Nevada or Virginia where Democrats had the governorship and the legislature and made some efforts to expand public sector worker rights. It's also, as many people here are aware, noteworthy that lawmakers have much more ability to do this at the state level in the public sector than they would in the private sector, as much as they'd like to because of the limits under federal labor law preemption. Another thing I'd note, and I don't write about the economics of the labor market as much as someone like Lydia does really terrifically, but it was interesting to hear from experts and from teachers in 2018 and 2019 during the teacher strikes that Noam was referencing, about how it's not a cabined off separate labor market for public sector employees, that when something happens with the tightness of the labor market or the wage standards in the labor market overall, that also shapes public employees' sense of what kinds of options they have outside of their job and what they can expect and how hard they can push at their job.
I think that's absolutely right. And I wonder, so because this recovery from a recession is like very different in lots of ways. And one of them is that we didn't go the route of austerity. So there were huge transfers to state and local governments in ways that probably gave them a little wiggle room on wages and staffing levels. I haven't taken a look at like how much or whether that's contracted, but I do know that like for teachers specifically, because teaching during the pandemic was so shitty, I think that there are a lot of places are just really hard up for anyone to come be in a classroom, which probably has strengthened the hand of those workers. And I don't know what that means for sort of membership, but having reported in Texas, like there's a fairly strong teachers union there. And, I don't think they have, the main legal difference is obviously it's right to work, but also like they don't have official bargaining rights over anything, but they still, just by virtue of like collective action, have a voice. And so I always thought that was really impressive.
And that is something that we're seeing changing, Lydia, in terms of that whole collective voice and labor management cooperation, which isn't under our normal structures of the NLRB and or the local PERBs. I see Wilma's hands up. Wilma, you're on mute. You're muted, Wilma.
Yep. Thanks.
Wilma's our current president. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. So my question to you, Juliana, obviously you cover Philadelphia, but I wonder, the question for all of you is, to what extent do you see some regional differences in what's happening with worker activism? I mean, you all have talked about, and everyone recognizes this remarkable surge of worker activism in the last few years. Noam was on a LERA panel a couple weeks ago questioning whether this surge in worker activism likely represents an inflection point or some transformational moment in our labor market reform, et cetera. But how widespread is it? It gets a lot of coverage, but is it really happening all over the country? Is it happening red and blue America?
Thank you very much, Wilma. Anyone want to take a run at that one? Probably all four of you.
I nominate Josh to talk about Starbucks.
I would say, and Wilma spoke to this somewhat in the conversation that we recorded together on Saturday. And so I would refer everyone to Wilma's own answers to Wilma's question. But since I can't play them for you here, I would say some of each. Clearly, we have seen this remarkable wave at Starbucks that is everywhere, is in North Carolina, is in Alabama. And at the same time, a lot of the other signal examples, whether they're victories or just striking efforts, are in places with high concentrations of unionization and union culture already. It's not by accident that in New York, you saw the Staten Island Amazon win, and you saw the REI win, and you see some of the Apple organizing that's happening, and you saw a bunch of Starbucks. And in part, this gets at one of the things, I guess it's becoming clear I'm really interested in, which is this question of what state and local governments and leaders can do about private sector organizing given federal preemption. And Amazon is particularly interesting, I think, because there was a lively debate between unions like the retail workers and unions like SEIU 32BJ and the late president, Hector Figueroa, about this question of, are we better off trying to keep Amazon out unless we can win some kind of neutrality agreement? Or is that unrealistic? And are we better saying we'd rather Amazon be here, because then once they're here, they're more likely to be organized than if they're somewhere else? And because of the weaknesses of federal labor law, unions often find themselves reaching for things like zoning law as a sort of shadow labor law that in some ways carries more teeth in dealing with companies. But also we've seen, I mean, when you talk to workers in some of these campaigns, it makes a difference. I'm in Buffalo right now, whether people know someone that's in a union and whether they had a positive or a negative experience with it, and whether there is a sense, again, this came up in the teacher strikes, a sense that the community is also on their side if they make an effort to organize. And so it remains an easier thing to do in New York than in North Carolina. But the more that Starbucks unionize in North Carolina, the more that that contributes, at least in a small way, to changing the environment for other people too.
Thank you so much. And Joel, I see your hand. Joel? Oh, no, I don't see
Exciting
you.
to have a panel with
Oh.
a prior, a neutral who's a prior labor organizer as your moderator. And I have a labor organizing question for you about your own work itself. As you may know, LERA has a series of industry councils. And Bill Canick, who's on the call, has been helping to organize what could be a new industry council for labor journalism. The actual wording of it, he can say more about. But traditionally, the industry councils provide a forum for people to talk about work in their industry or sector, as well as a go-to point for programming for LERA and for other activities. And so my question for the panels, if there were to be an industry council of some kind for labor journalism, what would be your must-have? What would you most want to see such a group do that would be of use to you? And I'll preface it by saying that I know labor journalists, like most journalists, are fairly independent individuals who each do their own thing, so to speak. And so the idea of collective voice and collective work may be a new thought. But in a sense, LERA is a place where you could have a home for the work itself. And I'm wondering if that might be of service to you, and if so, in what way?
And Joel, I would also say provide a formal organized forum in which these independent-minded labor journalists would have a context to speak to each other with some regularity and under the umbrella of when speaking with many over the last number of years, labor journalists, we've really come to understand that there's nothing like that that's out there for people who work in this topical focus. And so our thought is to create a context that they would fill with substance, right? But it also, once you're within the halls of LERA, is formally, there's much more opportunity to interact with the different constituencies that make up LERA and have, through LERA, ties to a profoundly rich narrative of contacts who can be reached for feedback on a wide variety of topics. I mean, once you're in LERA, they'll answer. They might answer anyway, but you're so this was our thought about broaching the topic of an industry council, which so I'll back off then.
I don't want to speak for anyone. I feel like these conversations usually take place among journalists within their own journalism organizations. There's like all kinds of like Society of Professional Journalists, like IRE. So feel free to form one. You may find people who will join. I just think that like these are the types of conversations that I think are really good to have, but it can also just sort of happen informally. And also, like, we do have the great luxury and privilege of usually getting our phone calls returned to just pick people's brains. So I think that would be the difficulty you would encounter. I mean, it's a really well-meaning and like potentially useful thing. I'm just, I'm a little bit, I can't tell you that it would be like immediately attract a huge membership.
And I will say that the impetus began when certain labor journalists started to organize and engage in collective bargaining, that suddenly, as an industry or sector, the work itself was now being negotiated over in visible ways. And I don't know if that is an important part of the equation or not.
And there's certainly now like a much bigger group of labor aware journalists, right? Like Condé Nast is organizing, Team Vote, like, so, you know, if you like reach out through the News Guild maybe and see if anyone has interest in participating in something sort of more formalized.
Hey, thank you. And David, you flashed me that there were a couple of questions that you wanted to hone in on. Could you, I don't see you, I'm sorry. David Lewin?
Let me get off mute. I think
Oh,
those
thank
were the ones that I asked previously that were submitted by Stephen, Sylvia, and somebody else here too. There were the two questions I asked. But there is something I do want to ask our journalists beyond what Joel has just asked them, which is this. Do companies come to you and say, we know the kind of stuff you do, we want you to join or head up our corporate communications department or community relations department? And I ask this in part because companies have become much more aggressive in recruiting faculty in schools like the ones we teach in to join them. The head strategist and digital economist at Amazon, for example, was recruited 8 years ago away from the UCLA Anderson School faculty. There's this labor market kind of movement. So my question is, do you get these approaches by companies?
I have not.
I mean, I haven't, oh, Julia, sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just saying I have not either. It happened more when I was reporting on tech, actually.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have not either. Not either. And like Juliana, I think it's fairly common, and not fairly common, but you see it in tech. I think that's right. Like there have been some high-profile tech journalists over the years that have gone over to work for industry. I think less so in our niche.
I mean, I think it does happen in lots of industries. Like the Chronicle was constantly getting poached by like the hospitals and the oil companies. They would go directly to the reporters that covered them. So I think it happens a lot. I think probably less in our sector maybe, at least I think there probably are folks who've gone to unions or sort of like other lefty groups. Actually, I think the Economic Policy Institute's former communications director came from the Wall Street Journal. So it happens a lot, but not personally.
You can imagine that the New Yorker might be thinking of writing a piece, maybe having one of you write a piece on why poaching has become a term used as a synonym for competition in the labor market, as opposed to a description of what you do to an egg. So who knows? Bonnie, what else do we have?
Well, Larry has his hand up. Larry Michelle. Yeah, come off mute.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, I've hired several journalists for communications jobs. I tell you the truth, I don't recommend it. Because they're different. They're really different. They're really different. Some have been good, some not. But I want to ask about the new unionization in the electronic media, and even traditional ones where we've talked about the LA Times. Back in the old days, the kind of people at LERA would write articles about what's happening in collective bargaining in newspapers and new media. And then we would learn.
You froze, Larry. Larry, I think you're frozen.
I think Larry may be making a point that process has frozen.
Great humor, Josh. I love it. So, well, until we get Larry back from this frozen state, David, did you have anything further? Now you're muted. David, you're muted.
Yeah, I've checked the chat and I think we're, well, wait a minute. Oh, that was Larry Michelle. Yeah, no, I think we're up to date insofar as questions raised through the chat or the hand are concerned. But if anyone else has questions, they should pose them now because we're almost out of time for this
Yeah, we've only
session.
got 4 minutes.
Maybe there's a way to frame where I think Larry was going, because he was going to ask a question about collective bargaining that's taking place in this sector. And I wonder if, I'm not sure that this was the question Larry was going to ask, but as journalists who write about collective bargaining in other domains, what do you see as the storylines that will be emerging about collective bargaining among all labor journalists and even mainstream labor journalists through the Labor Guild? That, you know, is this any different than collective bargaining that we see in other sectors or not?
Thank you, Joel. Anyone want to take a run at that one?
I mean, I do think that it has a unique, labor organizing in media has a unique advantage because our jobs are to communicate with each other and then project out to the world like what we think about things. And we have a like pre-existing platform to do that. So I think like that's why the progress has been so quick. And I think that it has had varying effects, right? Like many of the companies that have unionized haven't even gotten contracts yet. Some of those that have seen radical wage increases, which is amazing. Some of them have been totally shut down. So like, it's hard to generalize, I would say. Uniformly when I talk to people who have unionized, they're glad they did it. Even if it means like, or layoffs happen because the employer wants to make a point, like this is what happens when you unionize. Well, then it was probably gonna happen anyway, and they like got decent severance. So that's kind of what I think we know about it at this point.
Thank you. And I realize that we are out of time. I really want to thank the panelists very much for this really, really rich discussion. As those of us who are on this media committee thought about doing this, we envisioned that we'd have a rich discussion about what is going on. And coming out of the last recession and then going into the pandemic just a few years later, many of our industries have suffered so much, including the education industry, where teachers left and are never coming back because they found other jobs and things like that. So there's still so much more to discuss, but we don't have the time to do that. But I want to thank all the panelists. Do you have any last minute things that you'd like to say very quickly? Because we only have 2 minutes left.
I would take my 30 seconds, since David mentioned poaching, to note a story I did in which I learned from filings that Uber and Lyft in Illinois were arguing that the names of their drivers who were licensed should not be made public, unlike other types of licensed drivers, because if they were, it would be easier for companies to poach their workers.
Interesting. Anyone else?
They argued that these workers' names were trade secrets at the same time as arguing that the workers were not employees, which I found interesting.
The current Jeopardy champion, who's won 14 in a row and is at $250,000, is described as a rideshare driver.
Okay. Noam, did you have any final thoughts for us?
I'll just pick up on something that David Lewin just said, which is, I think one prominent theme of, my coverage and others over the past several years has been like the proletarianization of work. So you've gotten like very highly educated people doing pretty grueling jobs, whether it's rideshare or working at Starbucks or Amazon, or even being an adjunct professor or adjunct instructor at a university. And so I do think that's one of the major things driving, the energy around organizing and unionization. So I think you meant it half seriously, but I think there's a lot of truth contained in that observation.
Juliana?
Not much, just support your local paper.
Aha. And Lydia?
Ditto to that. And also, honestly, thank you all for the research and work that you do. I troll research papers relentlessly. And if you have one that you think illuminates something about the labor market or the condition of workers, please send it my way, because we can make a whole story out of it.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to all of the participants for joining us. We really, really appreciate having all of you here at LERA. I know it's difficult to be doing these things on Zoom, and this is our second full year on Zoom. So, and I see that Stephen Greenhouse has joined us. Stephen, thank you so much. Thanks to all the panelists. You were just wonderful. So a big hand of applause for all of you. And please join us again. We really appreciate hearing from you. And really, we do regularly read all of your stories. So keep writing, please. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Bill Canick, as a member of the Media Award Committee, I want to thank you myself, and then suggest don't hesitate to go through the program and look at the papers and the presentations and the workshops and the panels to identify people to put in your little Rolodex for different topics that you might want to contact. That's one of the joys of LERA, is that we have this rich diversity of incredibly knowledgeable and experienced people. So we're here as a resource for you. So that's it. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, David. Thanks to all of our panelists. We really, really appreciate you. And thanks for the participants for joining us this morning. Take care. Stay safe.